A closely watched Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation has come to an end after 2 days of intense communication and exchange. Leaders of member states and representatives of regional and international organizations met in Beijing with the intention of promoting China-Africa cooperation to a higher level in coming years. So what foundations have been agreed upon as the basis for future development and cooperation? In the face of criticism and doubt from the West, how will China and Africa face challenges and dispel misgivings? And what impact will closer China-Africa ties bring to China's other relationships in the international arena? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Liu Guijing, former Chinese ambassador to Zimbabwe and South Africa, and Mr. Walter Rigu, managing director of CAMAL Group. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Deng. So, gentlemen, let's start with the achievements of the two-day summit here in Beijing. In the next 3 years, China will put forward 8 initiatives and back it up with a pledge of financing amounting to $60 billion. So, Ambassador, give us a sense of this number, $60 billion. Is it big enough to reach all those consensus and goals reached at this time's summit in Beijing?
Well, Africa has been constrained by 3 bottlenecks. One of it is lacking of infrastructure. So China has been constructively engaged in this area to work together with the African countries to put more infrastructure on the ground. Well, 60 billion is something, but it cannot satisfy all the demands and needs of Africa. But it can play an important role in working together with Africa and African Union. You know that Africa as a continent has, each African countries has a lot of differences in their level of development, in their infrastructure need, and in their culture. That is diversified continent. So this infrastructure, infrastructure building initiative launched by China to satisfy all the demands of Africa is need high-level planning and need discussions on bilateral basis under the framework of FOCAC. I think that will go a long way in helping the continent in addressing its infrastructure problems. Of course, Africa needs more partners, and also we welcome Western countries and other countries do not pay their lip services, but to put some real things on the continent to help Africa. Since that Africa welcome definitely will be welcomed by China. So that is what we mean, the community of shared future.
Mr. Rigu, you attended the whole summit all through the way. What's your main takeaway from the vibe and achievement of the summit?
First of all, I think this summit was very positive. I attended the last summit in Johannesburg and the last one in Beijing, and I think there's been a big shift from FOCAC 3 years ago and 6 years ago.
Tell us more about this shift.
Yeah, and the shift actually, what has happened to me from when I look at what has happened is that China is actually listening to Africa more, because everybody is going to be focused on this 60 billion figure. But 3 years ago, it was still 60 billion. What is the big difference between now and 3 years ago? I think if we dig deeper and look at what this 60 billion is composed of, is very interesting. And one thing I would just like to point out, for instance, is the trade financing. Now there's an element that has been added to the 60 billion, which is trade financing, which means that Chinese companies that will import African products can now get trade financing from China. This means that, you know, the Chinese companies have no option but to import. You're already given the money, so there is no longer an excuse. And this will only help to improve one issue which has been constantly raised, is that China needs to open the markets, China needs to be more open to African exports. So the Chinese government has listened and they have added this trade financing, which is very interesting for me.
So talking about trade, what do you make of the current trade structure between China and Africa? Is it complementary, or is there anything needs to be further improved?
Of course, there's much room for improvement. I think to understand China-Africa trade, you have to understand China domestically. And the China of 10 years ago is not necessarily the case now. 10 years ago, China was focused a lot on investment in fixed assets. And when you focus on investment in fixed assets, the economy demands a lot of raw materials. So at that time, China's engagement with Africa was mainly focused on resources. And that's because the Chinese economy needed it. But now the Chinese domestic economy has shifted. For instance, China wants to cut over 100 million tons of steel capacity. This means that all the resources that are being imported to cater for this demand are no longer needed. Chinese economy now is going to be focused on domestic consumption. The Chinese middle class is expanding. All these people have different tastes. They need to import. And for instance, the example I'd like to give is that, something as simple as South African wine. 10, 15 years ago, nobody knew about it. The increased imports is more than 30 to 40% in the last few years. So yes, the structure of the China-Africa trade is still heavily tilted towards raw materials, which is not ideal. But as China changes domestically, the China-Africa trade also is changing as a consequence.
So let's talk about this from a historical perspective, Ambassador. Ahead of this summit, you said, and I'm quoting, "Our policies have been very consistent. We build on past success and move ahead." How would you characterize a past success? And by saying move ahead, what exactly is the destination?
Yes, because the experiences of past access are very important, but they need to be adapting to the changing situation. That's why, as our colleague just correctly put, that there are a lot of shifts and fine-tunings. But the basis for that shift is the development of the change of the situation in both Africa and China. This FOCAC meeting in Beijing focuses more on the industrialization kind of initiative, and focus more also on capacity building. Capacity building is a really important area. So it mainly consists on two major areas. One is to exchange our experiences in development and to share that successful stories between China and Africa, and for good governance and for poverty reduction. And China is more than willing to exchange our experiences in poverty reduction in those areas. And another area for Africa which is important is lacking of skills and technologies. So that's why within the FOCAC platform, the Chinese government is going to provide more scholarships, 50,000 or something, and training opportunities, another 50,000. And also the priority will be to creating more jobs and exchanges between the youths. That is why to invite 2,000 youths from Africa to visit China to deepen mutual understanding and for the future cooperation of China.
And we'll be talking about people-to-people exchanges
Yes.
later in the program. But having said that, you're saying that earlier financing models or projects are all a success. So there is no debt trap for Africa?
Yes, you know, the form of cooperation between China are mainly from government to government. The forms are mainly kind of ODA or foreign aid, what is termed. But now more and more, the Chinese entrepreneurs and businesses are playing more important role. China gives certain soft loans to Africa, but those loans are used for infrastructure, for productive activities. So that will in return enhance Africa's debt continuity, sustainability, and to enable the continent to be more capable to pay back the debts. I think that is some differences between China's way of giving soft loans and other countries, maybe in a sense.
Mr. Rigoud, do you think there is any debt trap for Africa from China?
I think the debt issue, like I've said before, it depends on country-by-country basis. I think the minister from Djibouti, he put it the best. He says everybody recognizes that Africa has a financing gap. China is one of the alternatives. If not China, who? And that's really the question that countries need to pose to themselves. China is offering one solution, right? So if people are going to criticize it, then you need to have something else to replace it. And so far, multilateral institutions such as the World Bank still continue to hold a majority of the debt. But there are over 50 countries on the continent with a very large financing gap. So how will this be solved? That is the real question that people should be examining.
So do you think there's a kind of unified and a mainstream public opinion regarding China's increasing involvement in Africa's development?
I think the general reflection from Africa, according to a very famous consensus institution called Afrobarometer, is that more and more African people look at China's involvement in Africa as positive, as constructive, as conducive to their life. I think that's one of the evidences to show that China's involvement in Africa is welcomed by African people, basically. But of course, there are a lot of room for further improvement and to make sure that the grassroots people
Talking
will
about improvements in what particular regards?
You know, this forecast starts to address the areas which needs to be improved. One is that to get more people involved with the forecast cooperation, that is to pay attention to women's role and youth role. Another area is that the capacity building in Africa is an important one, and China will give more inputs on that area. And also the projects which are directly linked to people's livelihood will be also be the priority. Though the projects might be small, but they are important to the daily life of the people. Well, infrastructure, of course, remains an important area to connect the African continent, but more and more to lean on areas which are directly linked with people's life and job creation and technical transfer and capacity building.
What's your take on this, Mr. Ringo?
No, I think, looking at the macro, I think the impact of China has been generally positive. But we should not kid ourselves and think that everything is going smooth. But for me, like I said, what made this FOCAC different from the last FOCACs is that I've actually seen a change. And like I mentioned, one of these changes is that China seems to actually be listening to what the African side is saying. And one example I would give, for instance, is the issue of ivory. The issue of ivory, China was the biggest market for ivory. The African side made a lot of complaints about this. The Western side also added their voice to it. And as you see, the result was that China imposed a ban on the ivory. If you look at the things that have been achieved in this FOCAC, like I said, compared with the 2015 FOCAC, it has shifted. For instance, there has been more emphasis on peace and security. There's been more emphasis on environmental protection. There's been more emphasis on capacity building. These things did not necessarily exist in the FOCAC of 2012, which shows that FOCAC itself is evolving. I think for me, the China-Africa relationship, the way it's moving forward is like the Chinese saying, you know, Moja Shito Goha, which basically means, you know, we're crossing the river by filling the stones. Right. We should not expect everything to be perfect, but we should learn from the mistakes. And I think for the most part, China has done this. And just one thing I would like to add is that what I've seen different from this FOCAC than the previous FOCACs is that there's been a lot more involvement from the business sector, especially from the African side. There were a lot more companies that came to China this time than, you know, in 2012. There were a lot more companies here than in 2015 in Johannesburg. So that shows the relationship is changing. And for me, it is interesting because I can meet companies from South Africa, from Namibia, from Mozambique, from Benin, from Guinea. And if the FOCAC didn't exist, the chance of me meeting those companies and, you know, for us to conduct business throughout the continent would not be possible.
So, Ambassador, when you have a larger and larger investment and cooperation with a particular part of the world, you need to think about risk management. We earlier mentioned this debt trap term sensationalized by some Western media, but we also know that there's another term, new colonialism. That's a non-issue. We're not going to dig into it, but should China be very serious in preparation for Western hampering in China-Africa cooperation?
Well, yes. You know, the risks for China-Africa cooperation do exist, and a lot of blah blah and noises, you know, from the Western media or politicians are there. And the Chinese companies cannot wait till everything become perfect. because and that will be too late. And though there are certain risks, but there are a lot more opportunities. And risks and opportunities are always linked together. More risks, maybe more opportunities. The Chinese entrepreneurs, private business people need to grasp this opportunity. Of course, on the Chinese government side, it needs to do more in address the investment risk, problems. That's not kind of easy thing, but we can do it through the market, operation. That is for Chinese companies to invest in Africa. When they calculate the cost of the investment, they should put the risk as one of the costs and try to adopt certain measures, try to mitigate the impact of the risks, and also buy insurances in order to avoid certain losses when things are getting worse, so their business are influenced negatively.
So, gentlemen, let's talk more about the 8 initiatives reached this time. Earlier, we touched upon trade facilitation. But what comes on top is this called industrial improvement. So what's the status of Africa's industrial capability right now? And we know that actually China and Africa are in different stages of industrialization. How can each side address each other's needs?
Yeah, I think the issue of industrialization has been put on the forefront of this FOCAC, not only by the African Union, but each individual country. Again, this is not an easy issue because there are over 50 different countries, all with different stages of development, all with different economic endowments. For instance, if you compare South Africa to, say, Comoros, one is a small island, one is a large economy. So really, yes, the issue of industrialization is important, but what really got to me, and what actually I would like to point out also about the FOCAC, is President Kagame, he gave a speech, and in the speech he outlined, look, China has already agreed that we're going to deal with this relationship as equals, but it's also on the African side to prepare to receive Chinese technology, receive this financing, because China cannot develop Africa. Africa has to be developed by Africans. And for this to happen, the African side must come with real initiatives. It should not be China coming to your country to tell you, let's develop textile industry. It should be, we have the capacity to develop textile industry, but we need financing, or we need technical capacity, or we've already developed it. For instance, in the case of Ethiopia, we just need markets. We need market access. So how can China assist with that? I think that is the best, that's actually the best thing I heard from the political speeches, and it came from His Excellency Kagame. And actually, I would like to reiterate that when you look at industrialization, this is a government issue, right? This is an African government issue. They should prepare, bankable projects so that China is ready to come.
Right, and business-wise, more and more Chinese companies are choosing to localize their production. Do you think it's a very good trend for local employment and personnel training?
I think business is localized not only because it's good for employment, because it makes economic sense. Right now, if you look at China's domestic market, the wages have increased rapidly and they're very high. So it's no longer feasible, it's no longer economic viable to just export Chinese labor to do the projects. So it's actually an economic incentive to localize. Of course, then you have externalities where employment grows. But when we're looking to do the projects, they should be, they should be economically viable. And I think this is one of the challenges that His Excellency Kagame was discussing, is that the Africans understand Africa better than China, so it is on them to prepare what China is going to come to do.
Since you earlier mentioned this speech given by Rwanda's President Paul Kagame, and in his China visit, he also said that China's engagement in Africa has been deeply transformational, both internally and with respect to Africa's global position. How do you understand this?
I think there's two things. First, Kagame, being the head of the African Union, has revitalized that organization. And it's easier for China to deal with one, continental organization than to deal with 53 countries. So from that perspective, even if you look at China's commitment to peace and security and the aid that will be given to the military, it's not being given to individual militaries, it's being given in the context of the AU. And so actually in this FOCAC, the AU has become a more central position. And that's the reason for that is partly because of Kagame's leadership of the organization. So yes, I think China is ready to engage the continent, but the continent also needs to come with one voice. And the only way to do that effectively is going to be the African Union. So a strong African Union is good for Africa, but it's also good for China-Africa because China can engage through that mechanism.
So let's talk about infrastructure connectivity. In recent years, we've heard a lot about roads and railway links. For example, this Nairobi-Mombasa rail link and many rail expressways and highways in Africa. So what could be the next focus in this particular regard, Ambassador?
I think next focus for this particular area is to link the infrastructures at the continental level. And that's why China committed to work together with the African Union on the overall African infrastructure connection plan. Actually, in the AU 2063 agenda, there are certain charters and articles dealing with Africa infrastructure, and they have another separate plan on the continental level infrastructure planning. But for China, what we can do is that we could help Africa in financing certain projects, and that, of course, based on the priorities of Africa. For instance, if you want to build a kind of sea-to-sea road like Cape Town to Cairo, maybe certain areas or certain countries there are already roads, but maybe on other countries they have poor roads, it needs to be evacuated, and other countries have no roads. So if you just build a few sections of roads to link them, and that would be a kind of C2C, dream, and actually could be realized. So that high level or continental level, planning is very important. I think in the future maybe the infrastructure involvement from China would be focused more or less on these areas, not only like before on individual countries.
So what about, but after all, it's still a very large continent. Do you think aviation will take a big role in this bid, Mr. Rigi?
Yes, I think aviation will remain important because, for some countries, building railways and building roads takes time. Commerce needs to happen. So for some places, the only option is aviation. So I think in this sense, China is developing its own aircraft. It's a challenge to Airbus and Boeing. So this presents an opportunity for the continent. I think the best thing that China has done in Africa is actually create competition. And that is partly one of the reasons we are seeing backlash from so many people. Because we should not think that before China started engaging Africa on a more concrete and higher level, that nobody was there. There were people there. There were roads that were being built before, right? There were mines that were being mined before. But they were being done by other people. Now China comes with a different model with different ideas. It creates competition. And as with any market, if there's competition, of course, there will be negative and positive voices. Yes.
And talking about infrastructure, what do you think the relationship between this newly reached China-Africa Infrastructure Cooperation Plan and the Belt and Road Initiative, which already extends massively on the continent, be?
Yeah, I think they're tightly linked because Belt and Road extends across the globe. It's not only focusing on one country. And also the infrastructure initiative in FOCAC is also not just focusing on one country. There was a lot of emphasis on regional infrastructure. So I think they're going hand in hand. And like the Chinese say, if you want to be rich, you need to build a road.
Ambassador, let's talk about green development, which is also another focus of this year's summit achievement. So many are saying that industrialization will be followed by pollution. And do you think there's already a way out of this centuries-old dilemma in Africa?
Green development is really an important area, and that has already drawn attention in Johannesburg FOCAC summit. And one of the 10 plans is for just to focus on this area. Now in the new major 8 initiatives, and green development occupied a priority area. So I think when Africa, it's better not to follow, I mean, the way China has done, that is polluted our country first, and then try to put a lot of money to address the issue. But at the beginning of the reform, so people of my age were pretty clear that there are a lot of voices, a lot of policies also concerning. We realized that we were aware about that. By that time, China was still, could not produce enough to feed our stomach. But though you are talking, such kind of environmental protection, but people or local government did not pay real attention to that. But now Africa has to avoid that kind of old roads taken by China, by all the developed countries. But that is not that kind of easy thing. But for us, for the Chinese government, for the FOCOC platform, and we from the start will be very strictly and very clear that all the industries, manufacturing sectors from China to be transferred to Africa could meet the environmental protection criteria in Africa. That is the minimum request. But to develop industry and try to avoid, try to have zero pollution is really, a kind of thing you cannot realize that.
Now let's talk about people-to-people exchanges. I just checked your company's website, Mr. Rigu. Many of your employees have the experience studying in China's higher education system. They're from Africa. What difference do you think that kind of experience can make?
Yeah, I think China offers a good, it's a good example of how to do things, but also it's a good example of how not to do things, right? And I think we really need to study both. And I think the positive part is that they understand, for instance, the importance of hard work, the importance of markets. We are an export-focused organization. We do not only look at one company. We are trying to understand how we can leverage on China's advantages in terms of technology, in terms of capital, in terms of human capital, right? At the same time, for issues like pollution, like I said, China offers a good example of not what to do. But what was available to China 30 years ago is not necessarily what is available to Africa today. There's better technology for solar, there's better technology for wind, and if these kind of products can be packaged in an economic way, I think the continent can see a lot of benefit.
Last but not least, Ambassador, let's touch upon the topic of security. And this time, President Xi Jinping said China will set up a China-Africa Peace and Security Fund and continue providing free military aid to the African Union. What's the thinking behind this?
Well, in recent years, China has paid much more attention to peace and security issues in Africa. And this is also the request from the African leaders to get China more positively engaged in this area. Now China has interests everywhere in Africa, and a lot of Chinese business people, a lot of investment there, tourists, students who are studying there in African countries. The armed conflicts, so any kind of troubles there are directly affect the Chinese families, the Chinese business people as a whole.
And local development also requires a political and
security.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for input. And that's it for this.